Welcome back to the channel. Thanks for tuning in for another episode. Today's is a good one. I want to address some offshore fishing tips that the pros are using to catch more fish than most other anglers. We all know that offshore fishing is probably the most difficult thing to do in the sport of bass fishing. The reality is we have great electronic tools, and the better you know how to use them, the better you're going to be at fishing offshore. But that's not what makes an angler great at being an offshore fisherman. So I've got for you guys today 3 offshore fishing tips that the pros are using to be very, very good offshore anglers. And I think if you can implement these 3 things, regardless of the electronics that you have on your boat, you will be a much better angler because of it and catch a lot more fish offshore. It's one of those things that takes some time, takes some work and some experience before you get to be really good at it. But if you can train yourself, you can become an excellent offshore fisherman like a lot of the pros that are out there. Before I share these 3 tips with you, I want to remind you that if you're looking for a little bit of help on your local lakes or a lake maybe you're going to on vacation, check out the lake breakdowns that I've done with fishthemoment.com. The link I will put up in the video description so that you can go check out the lakes that I've done. If I haven't done the one that you're looking for, you can request a personal lake breakdown from me, and I will go ahead and mark up the 40 waypoints based on the season that you would like me to address. All right, guys, so let's talk about offshore fishing. Offshore fishing is one of those things that is very difficult because you can't see what's going on. It's not like bank fishing where you can see what the bank looks like, you can see the cover. You're out in the middle of the lake relying almost solely on your electronics to tell you how deep you are, where are you at in terms of the lake? Are you fishing? Are you using your mapping so you can see that you're on an offshore hump or maybe a long point that runs out into the lake? The point is you're out in the middle of nowhere and you need to trust whatever it is that you're using to know exactly where you're at. What I would stress though is not just to pull up to a piece of offshore structure and start fishing. The best pros out there spend hours idling around, graphing, looking for those specific areas and looking for specific fish holding pieces of structure. And most of the time, they're not going to make a cast until they see fish. And that might not just be bass, it might be bait fish. But most anglers I know won't expect to catch bass offshore if there's no forage species around. So if you're not marking bass or you're not marking bait fish, chances are, even though that spot looks phenomenal, it probably isn't holding that many fish. So you're better off spending time behind the wheel of your boat and looking at your electronics and trying to identify an area where you either see fish, whether that's bass, or you see the bait that the bass are going to be feeding on. I can't tell you how the best anglers out there spend hours idling around without ever making a cast. I realize that that's not fun, but it is fun when you eventually find the spot. And that's one of the great things about offshore fishing. You're usually going to find an area where there's a school of fish. You're not going to find that many 1 or 2 fish spots. Generally speaking, when you find a good offshore spot, it's a good spot. Like you're going to catch a bunch of fish on not that many casts. And that's why people are willing to do it. And a lot of times your offshore fish could be some of the biggest fish around. So your average size could be fantastic. But really the key here is you got to keep looking. You got to trust your electronics to find those spots that are holding bait fish and bass. And if you're not seeing either, don't waste your time. It doesn't mean it's a bad spot. It just means at that time, it's not going to be a productive spot. You may graph that same area 3 years from now and find the mother lode, but they're not there if you're not seeing them on your graphs. So you got to trust your graphs and what you're seeing. The second thing to keep in mind is that as much as you're out there looking around, trying to find ideal places that those fish are holding on, you want to find as many isolated pieces of structure as possible. Those isolated structures could be a brush pile, could be a boulder, could be a single piece of standing timber, it could be a shell bed. The point here is you're not necessarily just looking for a break line that's a quarter mile long, because at that point the fish could be anywhere up and down that. You're much better off trying to locate specific spots that you can make targeted casts at. So if it's a shell bed, generally speaking, there's a sweet spot on the shell bed. If it's a brush pile, you want to make a cast right into that brush pile. You want to be able to hit these objects with only a couple of casts. I mean, so the point being, when you graph around for several hours, maybe you mark 20 different spots that look good. So you've got brush piles, a little rock vein, a little shell bed, maybe a piece of standing timber, maybe an isolated sunken ship. It could be whatever. The point is, you spend some time graphing around, mark it up, and then you can rotate through those objects. But when you pull up to an object, you may only fish it for 5 or 10 minutes, and then you go to the next one. The key here is you're fishing isolated pieces of cover, isolated structure that's out in the middle of the lake that, generally speaking, a lot of people have not found. And therefore, when you find a piece that's productive, you can have it to yourself. So it's just really important to try to identify those spots that are the sweet spot on the spot. So if you've got a big hump in the middle of the lake that's 100 yards by 100 yards, you want to try to find that key spot that's always going to have the fish, versus pulling up to a hump now and having to fish a 100 yard by 100 yard hump that's going to take you 2 hours. It's just not productive in that case. So finding the sweet spot on the spot or your isolated targets are going to be the keys to fishing offshore structure. A lot of the best offshore fishermen in the world are not necessarily even fishing that deep. They're just fishing a lot of targets throughout the day. They have hundreds of waypoints of one hit type casts. They pull up, make 3 casts into a brush pile, and they go to the next one. And they may not even be fishing just brush piles. They go from a brush pile to a rock pile to who knows what. The point is, they make few precise casts on that object and then go to the next one. The third key to being a successful offshore fisherman is to avoid some of the most obvious looking places out there. One of the joys of using your electronics is you can kind of get lost. You can just get on a bank and just go. You can get on a big offshore flat and just go. And the thing is, if you're avoiding some of the most obvious pieces of structure, you're going to have a much better shot at finding something to yourself that the fish are less pressured and therefore much more willing to bite. A lot of the best offshore fishermen out there avoid fishing the very obvious locations, the big long points, the things that everyone else is graphing. When you think about like TVA lakes, when there's an offshore ledge bite, there's a lot of schools on the most obvious stuff, but they can be very difficult to get the bite. Or it can be very difficult to get on the spot because there's 3 other boats that beat you to it. So if you can have a location with a school of fish to yourself, you can pull up and catch them, and no one will ever know that you caught a bass off that spot because it was an unobvious looking area. So the key here is, when you're out offshore fishing, if you want to be extremely good at it, you need to recognize you've got to put a lot of time behind the wheel, a lot of time graphing, and not that much time fishing. You want to identify either the sweet spot on the spot or as many isolated targets as possible. And lastly, don't look at the obvious stuff. Go try to find something to yourself that isn't in the most common community areas. You may know that that's there and have that in your back pocket, which is great. But if you want to be really successful at offshore fishing, you find the stuff that other people have not found. And that's going to take time and practice, but you can become good at it. And I tell you, the time and practice is worth it, because when you find offshore fish that haven't been fished, it's a lot of fun. So hopefully this was helpful. If it was, hit the like button, subscribe to the channel if you haven't done so already, and stay tuned. We'll have a new video tomorrow for you.